Welcome to part 2 of why Hitler was gay. In the last episode, we talked about the suspicious relationship Hitler had with his childhood friend, August Kubizek. Also, how he likely prostituted himself for money, and a testimony from a soldier who served with him named Hans Mend, who claimed that he and his fellow soldiers caught him sleeping with a man named Ernst Schmidt in the Mend Protocol, which is where we'll pick up from. Who was Ernst Schmidt? And what else did Hitler do in the military? We'll also look into Hitler's very guarded private life after he got into politics and his relationships with women. No one witnessed Hitler's change from an artist with no political affiliation to the extremist politician closer than Ernst Schmidt. We don't know a whole lot about him, which is a shame. I mean, the guy was alive until 1985 and knew more about Hitler's life during this era than anyone else. But we do know some. Born to the son of a flour miller on December 16, 1889, he eventually became a journeyman's decorator until the outbreak of World War I. We don't know where he first met Hitler. They might have met in Munich or in the military. But soon after they found each other, they became inseparable. They were both military runners, so they had more freedom than most other enlistees. So they had lots of free time, all of which was spent with each other. They were always together, on and off duty, as Schmidt himself described. The other soldiers saw them as a couple, as the Mend Protocol describes. Runners and soldiers in general were often quite close without it being romantic, but this was more than just a bromance. In 1933, Schmidt told a journalist that three of us in particular seemed to hang together: Hitler, Bachmann, and I. Personally, I was very much drawn to Hitler. To his dying day, Hitler never forgot his time as a runner and what it meant to have such close comrades. One of his best friends, and someone who stayed by Hitler's side until the end, was Max Mann, who was a sergeant of his. Thanks to Max and his other comrades, Hitler adapted and even enjoyed his military service, which he used to avoid. To be fair though, he did try to volunteer before, but he probably only did this so he didn't get deported back to Austria. The more he embraced the military, the more he was able to shake off the burdensome constraints of the affluent bohemian lifestyle he wanted to be a part of so badly in Schwabing. It was here when he discovered what he would later call the glorious meaning of a male community. Hitler's dependence on these conditions became apparent when he and several other runners got injured. Afraid of being transferred, Hitler was nearly in tears and begged his superiors to make sure this didn't happen. He told Sergeant Amand and his other generals how important this community was for him. This is probably why Hitler remained only a lance corporal. Even though he sucked up to authority and was a skilled runner, he never got promoted. He was offered promotions, but he always refused them. But why? Why would he refuse these promotions? Well, we do know if he accepted them, he would have to sacrifice the things that made him want to serve in the army, which were his comrades, especially Ernst Schmidt. And if he got promoted, he would not have been able to have the lifestyle he enjoyed the way he could as a lower ranked officer. If he became a sergeant, he would have to keep a cleaner image. Everyone knew the position of Lance Corporal was only temporary, but a Lance Corporal who never made sergeant after 4 years of service was considered suspect. Either they were incompetent or they had personal reasons not to do so. There could be many reasons why Hitler didn't want to get a promotion. Maybe he just didn't want to take on the extra responsibility. But because of the sexual relationships Hitler had with Schmidt and sexual relationships he likely had with other men in the military, as was talked about in the Mend Protocol, he likely didn't take the promotion because he didn't want to give that up. Or it was at least part of the reason. After World War I ended, Hitler seemed lost. The military was his life. But luckily for him, he ran into Schmidt in Munich. The two homeless and unemployed guys cemented their friendship and got through the troubling time together. Hitler at this point hadn't given up on his artistic career. He still took his art in for professional appraisal, even during 1919. With political revolutions happening all across the world after World War I, he still wanted to do art. But politics was also a valid option for him. It was just whatever worked out first. Unbeknownst to the world, this turning point in Hitler's life would also be the turning point of what direction global politics would take for centuries to come. Despite the popular notion that Hitler gave up on art after being denied from art school, he still dreamed of being an artist for many years longer. Unfortunately for Europe, that dream died because Hitler eventually got an opportunity in the political realm from a man named Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm will be very important in this series, but I'll talk more about him later. While Hitler was trying to make it in politics or art, Schmidt was looking for work as a journeyman decorator. During this time, they shared an apartment and did everything together. They ate together, walked together, and just about everything else together. Hitler was still in the military and used the money he earned from there to keep his head above water. But he spent as little time as possible in the barracks, since most likely he didn't have any friends there. He lost the community he had as a runner during the war, but he was still very much respected since he had great oratory skills, which was valued in a time where revolutions and counter-revolutions were happening in pretty much every country in Europe. You wanted good speakers on your side so you could get people to join your cause. But his personality was too abrasive and self-centered, which turned people away from him. He would get better at hiding this in the future. Although Hitler was in the army, it was only a stepping stone to doing what he really wanted to do, which was politics. To do this, he had to slowly distance himself from Schmidt. By March of 1920, Hitler had a pretty good amount of influence within the German Workers' Party, and Schmidt eventually joined the party with him. Anton Drexler, the founder of the German Workers' Party, certainly had a big influence on Hitler. He was very much influenced by Drexler's hatred of Jews and also his hatred of capitalism and Marxism. By the summer of 1922, Schmidt moved 60 miles away from Munich, and their relationship slowly faded. They still kept in contact and visited each other often. Hitler even sent Schmidt a gilt-edged copy of Mein Kampf, and was personally contacted by Hitler to help make propaganda after France surrendered in 1940. It's also likely that Schmidt's later financial and professional success came from the help of Hitler himself. Some of it was out of heartfelt care for his old friend, and some of it was to ensure Schmidt's loyalty to Hitler and to make sure he never betrayed him. And it worked. After World War II, good friends of Schmidt said he took care to never say anything about Hitler that might have harmed his reputation. Schmidt's personality seemed to closely resemble Hostler, and even more so, Kubizek. An assessment by the NSDAP from 1934 said that Schmidt tends to underestimate his own abilities, which, like Kubizek, made him very receptive to Hitler's tactics. But Schmidt was also attracted to Hitler's love for art and literature. His bookshelf was stocked with Goethe, Shakespeare, and many other classical writers. Schmidt and Hitler were both autodidacts, whose mutual attraction was based on more than just lust. Although Hitler was the more dominant one in the relationship, they both found a receptive companion to share their artistic interests with. Of course, Schmidt and most others took Hitler's sexuality to the grave. Many because it personally benefited them to do so, and would be life-ruining to do otherwise. Hans Mann's seemingly little care about the consequences is a rare case. Okay, since Hitler pushed Schmidt to the side while he focused on politics, how did Hitler fulfill his sexual urges while he was neck-deep in political affairs? To find that out, let's look into his private life. After Hitler was arrested for his initial 1923 coup d'etat, he underwent a kind of rebirth. All of his self-doubt disappeared, and he devised his political strategy and worldview, which is all explicitly detailed in his book, Mein Kampf. He changed his old stance, which was based on revolution through violence, similar to the Russian Revolution. He decided he would work his way through the legal route, and wanted to get elected legitly. 7 years later, in 1930, he turned the NSDAP into a well-respected political force. This culminated in the public giving much more credence to him than they did before. At this time, he succeeded in acquiring new comrades, the most important at the time being Joseph Goebbels, someone whose demagoguery was as powerful as Hitler's, which is why he was chief propagandist. But Hitler wasn't really close to him on a personal level. It was a mostly no-nonsense business relationship. Hitler was much closer to these other men. Rudolf Hess, his private secretary, Julius Schreck, his chauffeur, and Emil Maurice, who is missing from this picture for reasons I'll explain later. On the surface, it looked like an employer-employee relationship, which was for sure the goal. On no account could it appear as homosexual partnerships. This is probably why, for the first time, that women appeared in Hitler's public life. On Christmas Day in 1924, Hitler was pacing restlessly up and down Ernst Hans Fongel's apartment, and Hitler groaned, "Ah, my Rudy, my Hessler, isn't it terrible that he's still locked up?" After Rudolf Hess was released from detention, 9 days after Hitler, he never left his side. Observers of Hess at the time said he was an almost pathologically sensitive, weak, and impressionable person, and everyone noticed how feminine his mannerisms were. In 1934, Otto Strasser, knowing full well the legal consequences, accused Hess of being a homosexual, even citing Hess's own wife in support of this accusation. But Kurt Ludig, on the other hand, said he was masculinity personified, but also found him unapproachable. He said Hess never once looked him in the eye, like he was hiding something. He had a tough soldierly exterior, but a soft artistic interior. He was with Hitler daily. Hitler was even criticized by other party members for being with him far too much. Hitler and Hess were incredibly close. Even during Hitler's initial phase of his political career, Hess's wife believed that well-nigh magical forces were at work, in reference to their relationship. And Captain Karl Mayer reported that Hess often worked Hitler into emotional states and turned that excitement into political agitation. Mayer also said that Hitler would go into seclusion with Hess for days at a time before a big speech, because in some unknown way, he managed to get Hitler in a state that made him a more convincing public speaker. Through 1921 to 1922, Hitler became increasingly attached to Dietrich Eckart and Ernst Hans Fongel, and Hess withdrew into Hitler's peripherals. So he resumed his studies and spent some months at Zurich. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the rest of that, but this place. In fall of 1923, Hitler called him to assist in the coup. When that failed, he fled to Austria and stayed at Karl Haushofer's house, a man 25 years older than him, and is suspected to have had a sexual relationship with Hess before Hitler came into the picture. But Hess eventually turned himself in. While they were being detained, he reunited with Hitler and soon became Hitler's leading associate, and were both housed in the Feldherren wing, with many other officers and members of the NSDAP, who were detained in the Landsberg prison after the failed coup. But Landsberg was more like a vacation resort than a prison. A fellow prisoner at the time said it was a lively militant community in which the atmosphere was a cross between an officer's mess hall and a men's hostel. It included sporting contests and rowdy evening get-togethers. They also very much enjoyed the prison amenities, like the bathhouse. In a letter Hess sent to his mom, he talked about the hot baths always available to us in the modern bathroom reserved for us alone. But their behavior brought the governor down on them from time to time. He cracked down on them for being nude outside the fortress living room. They needed to wear clothes, and that had to be obeyed, especially since they shared rooms, which they were not doing. Hey, for all we know, Hitler may have been the booty warrior of Germany. Hess talks about Hitler getting his much-needed rest from the usual hustle and bustle while in prison, and was able to get his plans for the future in order. The first part of Mein Kampf originated here, with much help from Hess. With Hess, he could test the plausibility of his lies before he went public, and Hess influenced him as well, The Lebensraum, the territorial expansion concept, originated with him. Hess also helped Hitler write Part 2 of Mein Kampf in 1926, where they spent a great deal of time alone in the Kampfhostel, which was a small cabin on the edge of the woods. Officially, he was a secretary, and he was a damn good one. Goebbels described him as the ideal assistant: calm, amiable, shrewd, reserved, the private secretary. He arranged appointments and overnight lodgings, he made Hitler meals, dealt with mail, and was his personal advisor and accompanied him on travels. When Hess finally married his longtime fiancée in December of 1927, after Hitler told him to, Hess said Hitler was pale and trembling, and he was unable to eat anything out of sheer agitation and could not relax until it was over. Even though it was a marriage in name only, it still bothered Hitler. Although Hess did speak endearingly of his wife, she was never more than a comrade. Even she herself complained that all Hess got out of the marriage was, as she put it, a girl confirmand. Hess and Hitler's relationship cooled down a bit during the early 1930s, but when Hitler became chancellor in 1933, he made Hess his official deputy. He pretty much already was, but this time, it was official. He probably was the best suited for the job. As Hess himself said, "I probably know the Führer and his every last thought better than anyone else." Although they were incredibly close, it wasn't perfect. Hitler is reported to have told Heinrich Hoffmann in 1927 that Hess's introverted solemnity gets on his nerves occasionally. He was just not cheery enough for him. This is where Emil Maurice comes in. Called a high-spirited daredevil whom Hitler became increasingly attached to. Even though he had Jewish ancestry, Hitler didn't care and called him an honorary Aryan. Again, showing Hitler didn't really believe what he preached, as Hans Mend claimed. After serving a few months in World War I, Maurice became politically active and joined Hitler's party in 1919, and in 1921, he became Hitler's chauffeur and one of Hitler's closest associates. Julius Schwab said Maurice probably knew more than anyone else about Hitler's early days up to 1925. Like Hess, Maurice was also arrested in the coup, and was also a huge help in writing Mein Kampf, while also enjoying his stay at the Landsberg prison. After he got out of prison, he served Hitler, and was given the keys to Hitler's lodgings and did mundane stuff like laundry and other chores that would normally be done by a housekeeper. But if things got rough, he was always ready to fight. Like many of Hitler's boyfriends, he was tough on the outside and soft on the interior. That must have been Hitler's thing. He was very musically inclined. Heinrich Hoffmann's daughter, Henriette, described his tender guitar playing. She has a memory of him sitting with his back to a tree, playing while everyone hummed Irish folk songs. She thought of him as a sensitive person, not an ambitious slugger. Tenderness underlay his affable exterior. Hitler and Maurice were attractive to women, but only Maurice showed affection towards them. Remembering the stay at Landsberg, Hans Kallenbach tells of a romance Maurice had in prison with a woman who lived in one of the apartments across the way. Thanks to the inmates' incessant teasing, the Führer himself discovered handsome Emil's sentimental secret. He dismissed the matter with a forgiving smile. But Hitler kept a sort of jealous eye on his handsome Emil. He probably envied his easygoing relations with the opposite sex. If Hitler felt the same way, he probably would not have embarrassed himself at a New Year's get-together in 1924. Heinrich Hoffmann was throwing a party, and an attractive young woman lured Hitler under the mistletoe and gave him a passionate kiss. Hoffmann said, "I shall never forget the look of surprise and dismay on Hitler's face." After that, an awkward silence fell. Bewildered and helpless as a child, Hitler stood there, biting his lip in an effort to master his anger. Incredibly upset, Hitler left the party soon afterwards. His attitude towards women was obvious. Everyone around him, even the prison staff at Landsberg, said women and girls left him cold. If he was going to be the future leader of Germany, he had to get over his disgust of women. Since he was professing to be a traditionalist nationalist, he could not get pissed when girls hit on him, so he asked Maurice for help. They went around talking to girls and chatting up women. Maurice said Hitler gave money to the girls, but never asked for anything in return. They would even go to art colleges together to admire the nude women models. Did Hitler get over his contempt of women by doing this? Not really. His endeavors with women failed, and no intimacies ever took place. He was just never able to get intimate with a woman, even if they wanted to get intimate with him. His fixation on men was strong, and his self-imposed heterosexuality was too dependent on his willpower. Hitler's dislike of women was sensed by his staff, and it was arousing some suspicion about Hitler's sexuality. Hitler thought he got rid of this problem when his niece, Angela Rawball, also nicknamed Gilly, turned up in Munich. There are many differing opinions on what their relationship was. Some say it was sexual, and some say it wasn't. But any good interpretation of this must include Maurice. Hitler and Gilly probably first met in 1924, but never got seriously acquainted until 1927, when he took her, a friend of hers, and her mother on a tour through Germany, in which he invited Hess along, because he didn't want to be, quote-unquote, alone with the womanfolk. We're not sure when, but eventually, Gilly fell in love with Maurice. We don't know if the love was reciprocated, but it's apparent from a letter she wrote to her dear Emil on Christmas Eve in 1927 that Hitler wasn't in support of this relationship. Hitler gave her a thorough telling off, even threatening to send her back to her mom in Vienna. She said she never experienced so much suffering before, but it was good for Maurice and Gilly's relationship. Even though Hitler didn't support the relationship, he compromised. Kind of. They discussed it, and he said she could be with Maurice only if she was under Uncle Adolf's supervision. Not long after, Maurice and Hitler had a serious falling out. Maurice said that Hitler dismissed him because of a personal dispute, and also because he was mad that Hitler didn't support him and Gilly's relationship. Maurice claimed it was because Hitler was jealous that Gilly wasn't with him, but Maurice's assertions are pretty inconsistent with the tone of Gilly's letter. Nothing suggests that Hitler was consumed with jealous love for his niece. Actually, a letter he wrote to his friend, Winfried Wagner, about a week after this kerfuffle showed that Hitler was in a positive mood, and Hitler said he had a cheerful view of the future. So did Hitler and Maurice's falling out have to do with Gilly? Yes, but not as much as many people make it out to be. Gilly is reported to have told Otto Strasser that she overheard a fierce argument between Hitler and Maurice. Hitler told him, "You'll never set foot in this house again," and Maurice retorted that if he threw him out, he'll tell everything to the Frankfurter Zeitung, which was a German newspaper. This was Maurice's blackmail, which I believe was info about Hitler's homosexuality and not his supposed relationship with his niece. Hitler actually welcomed the rumors about him being romantic with Gilly. In early 1927, an anonymous letter accused Hitler of seducing a minor. We later find out the letter was sent by a woman named Ida Arnold, who was a girlfriend of Maurice. So the blackmailing had already begun. The letter was about Hitler's relationship with a 16-year-old girl named Maria Reiter. Hitler met her at the end of 1926, but no one really thought Hitler was into her. Even Maurice, who was the one who chauffeured them around. Hitler liked her, but not in a romantic way. He would never go further than a hug or a kiss. Reiter said he just didn't know what to do. It was just one of many attempts by Hitler to look like he was with a woman, and that he was capable of romance with them. But he was just not physically attracted to her, so he couldn't even attempt a real relationship. so I highly doubt he did anything with her. Although the blackmail attempt blew over, Hitler must have been under a lot of pressure. If people started digging into his private life, they would discover much more. And who knew more about his private life than Emil Maurice? Hitler feared that his women problems would be exposed, so he made preparations to defend himself in court. He was assisted by the senior party judge, Walter Butch, who he invited to his home in July of 1928. Butch had to promise not to reveal the contents of the secret meeting. It all suggests that he was threatened with a scandal, a court case that may expose some shady episodes from his past and ruin his reputation. Butch invited Geli and Hitler to his home to help them get over their grievous experience, in reference to Maurice's and Hitler's falling out. Instead, they made a trip to North Germany to calm down, and invited Joseph Goebbels along. It doesn't seem like this helped Hitler get over this grievous experience. Butch became very concerned of what he described as Hitler's contempt for humanity he showed in the fall of 1928. Butch consoled Hitler about his bitter experience of being betrayed by someone you thought you could rely on, and told him not to burden himself with this, so don't even bother with revenge, and just make a clean break. After this statement, it's doubtful the scandal revolved around his niece. It was probably the blackmail that Maurice had of his personal life that upset Hitler. Maurice probably had to blackmail him in order to dissuade Hitler from doing something rash, like he did with many others. Hitler wasn't in power yet in 1928, but he still had a lot of influence. But the dispute was settled without anything big happening. At the time, most people thought all of this revolved around Geli. In a diary entry by Goebbels, not even he knew the details of the case, but he assumed it did relate to Geli. Hitler welcomed that interpretation, because a dramatic break from Maurice would have rattled some skeletons in his closet that had to be kept private at all costs. After this, Maurice started a watchmaker's shop, which would have required a lot of money. And who could have provided that but Adolf Hitler? Otto Strasser claimed that Maurice was paid 20,000 Reichsmarks in hush money. Although Maurice was still in the Nazi party, he and Hitler were through. What happened to Geli after this? Well, she and Hitler were around each other quite a bit. Hess and pretty much everyone else said she was very pleasant to be around, and that Hitler made a habit of showing her off to everyone to impress his party comrades. Julius Schwab described her as a big child you couldn't help liking. One can only speculate if anything sexual happened between the two, but I believe it to be unlikely. Christa Schroeder, who was one of Hitler's secretaries, for example, was convinced that he had no sexual relations with her. Plus, I don't think Hitler was attracted to women, so I doubt he could look at her in any sexual way. She just seemed like a pleasant person to be around who Hitler wanted by his side to make it seem like he was straight. Be that as it may, Hitler wielded an ever greater measure of control over her, until he finally had her completely enmeshed in the strings of his own selfish interests. Hoffman reports Hitler saying, "Right, I love Geli, and I can marry her. But you know my views, and you know that I am determined to remain a bachelor. Therefore, I reserve to myself the right to watch over the circle of her male acquaintances until such a time as the right man comes along. What Geli now regards as restraint is in reality a wise precaution. I am quite determined to see that she does not fall into the hands of some unworthy adventurer or swindler." Hoffman's account is quite consistent with what Christa Schroeder inferred from her accounts of their relationship, such as that he had intended to school Geli for a life together. It makes sense. Having found a woman to be around, he had finally solved the problem affecting his reputation. The outward appearance of their relationship caused rumors to spread and circulate, and they were more than welcome to Hitler. This was much less damaging to his reputation than if rumors of his other relationships started going around. But Geli wanted to be more than a showpiece for Hitler, and she eventually started to loathe her life. She had fits of depression, attempts to escape, and an early death from a bullet in Hitler's revolver. Many have tried to figure out what happened. Did she kill herself? Did Hitler kill her? And if so, why? We really just don't know for sure. But most people, including myself, believe she took her own life. In 1933, Maurice appeared once more and was able to come back to the party after doing several loyalty tests. And Maurice and Hitler seemed to rekindle their old friendship. Did this rekindling happen because Hitler still loved him, or was it because he was scared of a data breach from him and thought it would be wiser to bribe him? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Now on to Hitler's other friend, Julius Schreck. Schreck was widely considered Hitler's right-hand man. In the spring of 1923, he and Josef Berchtold jointly founded Staastrup Hitler, which was the Hitler Assault Squad. The things Schreck's police force did was very exhaustive. Fraud, breaches of peace, grievous bodily harm, and much more. When Hitler's first coup failed, he fled to Austria, where he was soon arrested. He eventually became the first commander of the Schutzstaffel, or more commonly called the SS. But he wasn't really equipped for this role, as many SS chiefs believed. So, in 1926, he was replaced. After the falling out with Maurice, Hitler made Schreck his chauffeur. He was pretty much Maurice's successor. He was at Hitler's service around the clock from 1928 onward, for private trips as well as political engagements. Julius Schwab wrote that he always knew at once whether to bring his physical strength or his cunning or his driving into play, implying he did way more than just drive Hitler around. The members of the National Socialist inner circle turned to Schreck if they wanted quick access to Hitler. Rumors even circulated that Schreck's death in 1936 was caused by someone trying to assassinate Hitler, but Schreck was mistaken for Hitler since they looked so much alike. They developed a really close relationship on the long car rides they had together. They would often go on long trips, just the two of them, to explore the German countryside. And as Albert Speer noted, a photo of Schreck hung next to Hitler's mother in his private quarters on the Ober Salzburg. We don't know for sure what Hitler's sex life looked like during this time, but Hitler kept everything super hidden. But how did Hitler conceal almost everything about his private life? He established a circle of blind followers who were able to filter out anyone who wasn't supposed to be involved in his personal life. Hitler very rarely went anywhere alone. He always had some sort of entourage around him, who later became known as the Schaffereske. Many contemporary observers, and even people like Goebbels, were astonished by the weird people he surrounded himself with. Goebbels, after one encounter, said, "Oh, that bunch of Philistines. How can a person like Hitler endure them, even for 5 minutes?" So, what did Hitler find in them? The Schaffereske was a weird mix of obtuse aides, stoic bodyguards, stereotypical chauffeurs, and vulgar court jesters. At some points, he even had people like horse traders, bouncers, and beer hall brawlers. But by the end of the mid-1920s, 3 men had become crystallized in this inner circle, and stayed until the end. Max Mann, Heinrich Hoffmann, and Julius Schwab. These men acted as intermediaries into Hitler's personal life. They would manage his household, determine who got to see Hitler, and handled his finances. This is why we can only speculate what Hitler's sex life looked like after 1934. They hid his personal life incredibly well, so we don't know if he was still banging men at this point, or if he directed all of his sexual energy into politics by this point. People like Albert Speer considered Julius Schwab as Hitler's most faithful henchman. Even Schwab described himself as Hitler's shadow, and was able to say whatever was on his mind to Hitler, a privilege very few others had. But Schwab and everyone else in Hitler's circle had little desire or ability to influence him politically. They were more like his surrogate family, loyal, completely dependable, and would do anything for him. Well, that was the outward appearance anyway. But upon closer inspection, it was more like a ring of blackmail. The people in this circle had shady backgrounds. Only a detailed knowledge of embarrassing and incriminating incidents in his henchmen's past lives could guarantee his ability to control them at all times. Ernst Fangel was convinced that he held what he described as a moral bargaining chip and means of coercion over nearly all of them. They were vulnerable and thus compliant. This was how he spun a web of nefarious dependencies which no escape was possible. But Hitler was also kind and understanding to them, giving them money and excusing bad behavior. That's probably why, even as Berlin was in ruins and the Allies were in Germany, Schwab made the trip to Hitler's Munich apartment and burned everything that was related to Hitler. We still don't know what was in these documents, and he absolutely refused to tell anyone. He only gave us a vague idea what could be in them. He said that their disclosure would have had disastrous repercussions, probably on himself, but most of all, on Adolf Hitler. Gilai's death in 1931 was a big problem for him. His public appearance was once again in jeopardy. As a huge public figure, he couldn't leave his opponents and supporters in the dark about his reasons for his lack of marriage. In the months after Gilai's death, Hitler met two women that liked him, and he also liked back. The first was Magna Quaint, and the second was Leni Riefenstahl. Hitler could have married either one. Instead, he was reluctant, but it was effective in protecting his public image, although the solution was only palliative. First, we have Magda Quaint, private secretary and lover of Joseph Goebbels. She was so excited by Hitler's public speeches that she called him at his Berlin headquarters, and their first encounter went well, and it seemed possible that a closer relationship would form. She admitted that she was deeply in love with him, but eventually, she realized the feelings weren't mutual. She said, "It was not until I realized that, discounting his niece Gilai, whose death he will never get over, Hitler cannot love any woman, but only, as he always says, his Germany. That I consented to marry Dr. Goebbels, because now I can be near the Führer." For the first time, we meet a strategy Hitler employed as part of his sexual camouflage. Supposedly, after Gilai's death, he wasn't able to love another woman. But that's cap. Come on. We already talked about how the relationship Gilai had was with Maurice, and that Hitler just used her as a showpiece. But what also utterly negates this claim of not being able to love again is that he was courting another woman just 4 weeks after Gilai's death. But since Gilai's death, he was able to divert attention away from his lack of marriage. Now, he said Germany was his only bride, from whom he had to make personal sacrifices for. Of course, this was all theatrical. The tears he shed after Gilai's death may have been real, but the longer he stretched this sob story, the more fake and artificial it seemed. But at least it gave him the excuse to now say he has no love for anyone other than Germany. Leni Riefenstahl gives us insight into the myth that Hitler was married to his country, a myth ultimately based on his inner resistance to his homosexual inclinations, but having heterosexual aspirations. Riefenstahl describes the following. "It was a beautiful summer evening in 1932. And it provided a romantic backdrop to her and Hitler's date. Quite relaxed, Hitler spoke of his private life and of things that particularly interested him. Foremost among them were architecture and music. He spoke of Wagner, King Ludwig, and Bayreuth. After he had talked of them for a while, his expression and voice suddenly changed. Fervently, he said, 'But what fulfills me more than anything else is my political mission. I feel that it is my vocation to save Germany. I cannot and may not evade it.' It was dark, and I could no longer see the men behind us. We walked along in silence, side by side. After a long pause, he came to a halt, gave me a lingering look, slowly put his arms around me, and drew me to him. He looked at me excitedly. When he saw how averse I was, he at once let go of me. He turned away a little. Then I saw him raise his hands and say imploringly, 'I cannot love any women until I have completed my task.' Even though she probably wasn't as adverse to him as she wants us to believe, she clearly wanted to be with the man that she and so many others thought would soon be the most powerful man in Germany. But the point here is how we were able to see Hitler's attitude towards women who were in love with him. This instinctive aversion he had to women, which he claimed happened because he had a higher calling, was not true, which is why he used Gilai's death to mask why he wasn't attracted to women. It was a very effective technique. It showed him as a man capable of love, but was traumatized by Gilai's death and had trouble opening himself up to love, which made these women love him even more. You can't overestimate the extent of the self-confidence Hitler gained from this theatrical gambit. Its effects worked on everyone, not just women. In August of 1932, Kurt Lüdke tried to get the real reason why Hitler didn't marry Magna Quaint. Then, Hitler said he had been the happiest man in the world in Gilai's company. Then, he burst into tears. Lüdke was totally unarmed and completely unaware that the Quaint affair only started 4 weeks after Gilai's death. Hitler had told Lüdke that he kept hearing about his scandalous affairs with women, and all Hitler said about Kurt's rumors was that it was better to have women than men. We find out this turn of phrase was a linguistic borrowing by Hitler from the German-Italian author Curzio Malaparte. In his book, Der Staatsstreich, I think that's how you pronounce it, the author had described Hitler's profoundly feminine ethos to be detailed by public scrutiny, and he left his readers in no doubt as to the result of his studies. Hitler's feminine side accounts for his success, his power of the masses, and the enthusiasm he arouses in the general youth. Not a single affair with a woman is currently ascribed to him, states one of his biographers. It would seem preferable to say of dictators that not a single affair with a man is currently ascribed to them. Hitler would not let this innuendo slide. Hitler's opponents often used this to attack him. He was quick to learn that it would only benefit him to get gossiped about in connection to affairs with women. When he got into power, it became a lot easier to silence the rumors about his homosexuality, since it became really easy to get beautiful women in his presence. Now, he could cut down on his fake heterosexual charade he was showing to the public. It seems only one of Hitler's women was aware of her artificial role in these relationships. It was Hitler's very short-term wife, Eva Braun. It's implied in a remark she was reported to have told Eugene Dahlmann in 1938. Always the mission, the mission, the mission. Self-sacrifice and renunciation. In this way, he, Hitler, overserved with a smile. We have happily created the authentic masculine Reich. People naturally believe that my life at Hitler's side takes quite a different form, if only they knew. With Braun, he was able to get his ideal woman, a woman who accepted platonic cohabitation. She was not very happy in this role. He met her in 1929, and by 1936, she tried to commit suicide twice. By the way, she was only his wife for 40 hours. He only decided to marry her when the Allies were on their way to his bunker while the Empire collapsed. When asked about their strange relationship, Julius Schwab only gave evasive responses. When interrogated on why Hitler failed to marry her long before those final hours in the bunker, Schwab said, "That was the view he took. We often wondered why. We didn't understand it. He simply had his own ideas. More than that, I can't say about it." And when asked what Hitler's own ideas were, Schwab said he didn't explain why. He never went into details. And when asked if he loved her at all, Schwab said he was fond of her. And when asked that again, he gave the same response. Similar remarks came from Herbert Göring. Hitler's majordomo on the Obersalzberg said the relationship was easygoing. And when asked whether it was sexual, he said, "No, there was never anything like that. Their relationship never went that far. Never, never." Hitler didn't care if Braun was unhappy. As long as she kept up the appearance as his mistress, what she did mattered little to him. Before I go into why Hitler cracked down on homosexuals in Germany during his reign, even though he himself was gay, I want to bring up an interesting case of blackmail, which comes from Eugene Dahlman. His account is quite credible due to his close proximity to the events that transpired. Dahlman was a frequent guest of Otto von Lossow, the Bavarian Reichswehr commander, who was like a father to him. One evening, Lossow, Dahlman, and another man were sitting in a dinner hall to discuss Hitler's failed 1923 coup, which Lossow helped put down. Eventually, Lossow produced from a desk drawer a police file containing reports of Hitler's private life from the time after World War I ended. They were from the vice squad of the police headquarters on Strasse. Everyone in the room gasped at what a dangerous weapon Lossow had forged when he was at the height of his authority in Munich. He predicted that Hitler would gain a lot of influence very quickly, so he preemptively made some blackmail. The blackmail contained the occasions Hitler approached desperate young men who were unemployed and poor, and Hitler wooing them by talking about politics and encouraging them to get involved. At the end, he would invite them over to his apartment to spend the night. This was recorded many times. They all attested that a man named Adolf Hitler had invited them to meals in small restaurants and taverns in the Munich area. He talked to them about politics and how the world belonged to the Germans, and the conversations went on until nightfall. And these men, living in a post-war Germany, had nothing to go back home to except hunger and destitution. So they were okay with sleeping with Adolf, the good friend who never tired of promising to help them. This also tells us he was cheating with or had an open relationship with Rudolf Hössler, the guy we covered in part 1 who lived with Hitler in Munich. Another time when Dahlman and Lossow talked about Hitler's homosexuality is recorded in Dahlman's The Third Reich and Homosexuality, which says, in reference to Hitler, those privy to his past were as little in doubt about this tendency of his as the scholarly or non-scholarly reader of sexological works. It says, one of these people who was privy was Otto von Lossow, and how Dahlman and Lossow had an hour-long conversation talking about his special proclivity. Dahlman went on to say that Lossow had made the statement that he had ensured through trustworthy intermediaries that Hitler was aware that this material had already been conveyed abroad. In the event that he, Lossow, or his officers were attacked by the Nazis for betraying Hitler during the 1923 coup, these documents would at once be published by the international press. Lossow also strongly advised all present, in their own interest, to keep quiet about this information. And Lossow lived unscathed until his natural death in 1938, while everyone else who knew anything about Hitler's homosexuality was killed during the Night of Long Knives, which I'll go into more detail in the next part. The fact that Lossow was spared was shocking, based on Hitler's well-documented hatred of someone who he called a traitor. In short, it is hard to doubt that such a file exists on Hitler, and Lossow gathered these documents because he thought it would be useful to him. And if it was something inconsequential, Lossow would not have been able to use it as blackmail. So, most likely, Hitler was having sex with men. This is also confirmed by documents in the Lossow's family archives. Eventually, Hitler became too well known in Munich to get away with this lifestyle, and couldn't afford to make any advances that would be recorded by the Munich police. So around 1922, Hitler started his double life that was disconnected from politics that Hans Vogel and other people close to Hitler only knew bits and pieces of. I doubt Hitler stopped hooking up after this. At least, not for a while. But we really don't know what form his sex life took after he rose to political prominence. But author Peter Martin Lampel said some interesting stuff in an unpublished memoir called Niemandes Nacht. Namely, him and other former Freikorps men knew a lot about Hitler's homosexuality from back in Munich. For instance, his close relationship with a young Edmund Heinz. That is why I was not surprised, Lampel said, when Magnus Hirschfeld, a good friend of his, later told him in confidence that he possessed 2 original transcripts, which he had preserved with special care, and which embodied the statements of 2 17 or 18-year-olds from the time of the SA's foundation, including photographs of those 2 young men. Hirschfeld also cited the particulars described therein. These transcripts pinpointed Hitler perfectly, in the most personal way possible. Hirschfeld had apparently sent them to Moscow via a special courier. Lampel was absolutely convinced that Hirschfeld's information was accurate, and he believed at the time of writing, which was the early 1950s, that sufficient witnesses were still alive in that time to attest to Hitler's homosexuality. It makes sense why Hitler's personal life was kept completely and utterly hidden and fractured from everyone, even his closest friends. People in the upper echelon in the political sphere at this time would dig up dirt on anyone if they thought it would benefit them. So, Hitler had to be secretive about this. Otherwise, his reputation of being an uber-traditional German National Socialist would have been destroyed.